Well, let's get more on this issue, how to solve it. Madeleine Sumption is the Director of Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. Madeleine, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Morning. And Catherine Barnard is the Professor of EU Law and Senior Fellow in the UK in a Changing Europe. Catherine, hello.
Good morning.
OK, Madeleine, should we start with you? Just fundamentally, the change in numbers over the years, why are so many more people coming to the UK than they were, say, last year?
So most of the people who are crossing the Channel in small boats at the moment are claiming asylum. And we know from past research that the major driver of changes in asylum claims is stuff that's happening around the world. So if you look at the people who are coming across, we've had quite a lot of people from Afghanistan, for example, fleeing the problems that they've faced there. Also, Iran is another major country of origin for people crossing in boats. So a lot of it is about conflicts happening around the world. And we've seen in other countries in Europe have also seen increases in asylum applications. Ireland, for example, I think their numbers have quadrupled over the last year or so. In terms of why people are coming in small boats in particular, part of this appears to be the result of actually successful enforcement activities around the freight terminals in northern France, where people used to cross in lorries. That became much more difficult because of enforcement. And so, and that's been one of the drivers of people coming through this much more visible route of small boats.
And Catherine, earlier today, James Cleverly, Government Minister, told BBC Breakfast many of the people, the bulk of people attempting to get to the UK are economic migrants rather than fleeing persecution of war. Now, Madeleine, you said most are seeking asylum. Is that correct?
That is correct. And based on the data that we have of people who are getting their asylum decisions now, more than 70% of them have received positive decisions. That is, the Home Office has determined that they are people who qualify for refugee status.
So, Catherine, what do you make of the narrative that we're being told and, evidence like from Madeleine?
Well, I think Madeleine's absolutely right. The numbers who are successful in claiming asylum are really quite high, up to about 75% success rate, which tends to suggest that the majority are not economic migrants. They have a genuine fear of persecution. Now, again, if we just look at the numbers in context, last year the UK had about 48,500 asylum applications, which is significantly higher than previous years. I think it was about 60% up on the previous year, and last year was actually the highest for the best part of 20 years, but still only half of what the numbers that we had in 2002. So the point I'm making is, although, as your correspondent indicated, it feels like the numbers are going up dramatically, and indeed year on year that is the case, we have experienced many more in the past, and nowhere near the numbers that you find in Europe elsewhere, such as Germany last year 190,000, France 121,000. So we're still receiving many fewer than those other countries with large, rather similar size economies.
Is there as much uproar in those countries as there appears to be in ours?
Well, certainly there is resistance, but when Germany welcomed in 2014, 2015, best part of 1 million Syrian refugees, what is remarkable about the German population response as a whole was just how welcoming they were and how willing they were to try to integrate them into their community and to get them to do the jobs that a lot of Germans didn't want to do.
So who's, Madeleine, for example, who's, just to bring you in, who's been most successful at reducing illegal immigration?
I mean, I think this is an area, to be honest, that all governments find difficult, and many of them just if people are coming through clandestine means and then claiming asylum, then the big challenge for them is just managing the system and processing the claims, which is actually something that UK has been struggling with recently. The international example that comes up most in terms of trying to reduce the numbers of people arriving is Australia, and they were able to effectively eliminate the small boat crossings to Australia, but the context there was quite different. For various, it was operationally more feasible for them to simply turn the boats back, and they also introduced, I think, what's quite a brutal policy of removing everyone who arrived in a small boat offshore and not letting them come to Australia. Pregnant women, children, every single person, and so it's a model that internationally, I don't know, a lot of people wouldn't necessarily describe it as successful, in the sense that it's been incredibly controversial, the costs that they've been willing to pay in order to have that model.
The fact of this is, and Madeleine or Catherine, feel free to jump in, the fact of this is there are people who are making money from this, and people are dying in their hands, at their hands. Criminal networks, what is being done and what evidence is there that they are being tackled effectively, rather than the people who have literally sold livelihoods to be able to have an opportunity to escape violence or poverty or persecution?
I mean, there is quite a lot of... Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Madeleine.
There's quite a lot of activity targeting criminal networks. I think the challenge here is that they're quite decentralized. It's not like there's just kind of one or two networks and you take down a kingpin and the whole thing falls apart. But there are lots of different actors, and if you get rid of a few, other ones pop up in their place where there's money to be made. So I think that there's rhetoric about sort of smashing the criminal gangs. It's incredibly difficult in practice.
Catherine.
And I was going to say also, it is for those who have paid the gangs are often very reluctant to talk about what they've done and thus provide evidence, for the simple reason that they are very worried about what backlash there might be against their families back in their home countries. I mean, there is also a capacity issue too. The government is already struggling to process these asylum claims. It's taking well over a year for a lot of people, sometimes longer, and it's the same in other countries too. Although they've got better track record in actually getting through the numbers, but it requires considerable amounts of resource, which the government at the time of trying to cut back on public expenditure is unlikely to put more resource into the people needed to process asylum claims.
And Catherine, just this agreement that has been reached with France, I mean, there's been a lot of to and froing, there's been a lot of blame shifting between the two. Are you optimistic that this agreement will, pave some way forward to improvement of numbers and improvement of managing those crossings that are being made?
It will clearly help, and I think the most positive aspect of the agreement is that there's an agreement at all. Previously, there'd been a great deal of reluctance to actually come to some agreement with the French, rather than just sling mud at the French for failing to stop this the flow of migrants. So I think it's good that there is an agreement. In fact, if you look at the sums of money involved, it's relatively small. I think it looks like only about 6 or 7 million more.
8 million, yeah.
In terms of money that's actually been given to help fund this. And of course the incentives are not great, because we've already heard the French have got a far larger number of people claiming asylum there, and there is a sense that the burden of managing this should be spread across Europe as a whole. Now, of course, we are no longer members of the EU, and therefore we don't have access to the EU programmes. And what's really striking is that in the TCA, that's the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the agreement that the UK entered into with the EU post-Brexit, there was nothing in it on asylum matters. And so there is a sense that the UK needs to manage this problem alone, which is why I find the existence of the agreement already a positive step.
Did Brexit make it worse?
It's made it harder to manage the allocation of the of asylum seekers, because you've lost the rules under the so-called Dublin regulation, which allowed for countries to return, for member states of the EU to return individuals to the first safe point of entry in the EU.
Madeleine, how optimistic are you that this deal will improve the situation, this deal between the UK and France?
I think there is some evidence that enforcement activities make a difference to the numbers of people who are able to move. And so from that perspective, we should expect some impact. But there's also evidence that when you increase enforcement, often it can be a bit like squeezing a balloon. So you divert the activity to other routes, and sometimes more dangerous ones that bring new challenges that weren't anticipated. So I think there are also risks.
Yeah, and when you say squeezing a balloon, it's like if you squeeze one part, the other bit bulges instead.
Exactly, and actually one of the reasons that we have people crossing now in small boats is that is a result of the successful enforcement in the lorry terminals. So that was, people were diverted from one route to another, and then many people started using this new route once the sort of proof of concept was out there and people understood that this was a feasible way of getting across. So there are always these unintended consequences that are really difficult to anticipate.
Madeleine Sumption, Director of Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford, thank you. Catherine Barnard, Professor of EU Law and Senior Fellow in the UK in a Changing Europe, thank you very much as well for
Pleasure.
your thoughts and comments on this. Thank you. It's 25